Angela Ford had spent 11 years learning exactly how to be invisible in Eleanor Marsh's house. She learned which floorboards creaked outside the study, which hours the old woman wanted silence, and which words were never to be spoken above a whisper inside those marble walls. She had raised her own daughter inside the servants' quarters of that estate, buried her only child 3 years later, and taken on the raising of her grandson Tommy without ever once asking Eleanor Marsh for pity. She kept her head down. She did her work. She told herself that invisibility was the safest thing a woman in her position could ever hope for. But on one ordinary Tuesday afternoon, carrying a tray of tea toward the private sitting room at the end of the East Hall, Angela pushed open a door she had opened 1,000 times before, and the woman she thought she understood completely became a stranger in front of her eyes. There, in the one room of the house no member of staff was permitted to enter without invitation, sat Eleanor Marsh, the coldest woman in Atlanta, the widow every newspaper described as untouchable, sitting perfectly still with a sleeping 5-year-old boy curled against her chest. One hand rested on his small back, rising and falling with his breath. Her eyes were open, fixed on nothing, and wet in a way Angela had never once seen in 11 years of service. Angela stood frozen in the doorway, the tea tray trembling slightly in her hands, because the boy sleeping in the arms of the most guarded woman she had ever known was her own grandson, Tommy, and nothing about that moment made any sense at all. She did not speak. She did not move. She simply watched, because some part of her already understood that whatever she was witnessing was not meant to be seen by anyone, least of all her. If a story like this already has you wanting to know what happens next, make sure you like this video, share it with someone who loves stories like this one, drop a comment letting us know where you're watching from, and subscribe to the channel so you never miss what's coming. For a long moment, neither of them said a word. Eleanor did not startle, did not straighten her posture the way she always did when caught in a moment of vulnerability, did not reach for the composure she wore like armor in every boardroom and every charity gala. She simply held the boy the way a person holds something they are terrified of losing, and Angela, still standing frozen at the threshold, felt something cold move through her chest, a feeling she could not yet name but would spend the rest of that year trying to understand. What was a woman like Eleanor Marsh doing wrapped around a child who wasn't hers, in a room that staff had been forbidden to enter for 5 long years, with an expression on her face that looked less like affection and more like grief finally being allowed to breathe? The clock on the mantel behind them ticked on, indifferent to the fact that it was measuring what felt to Angela like the longest minute of her 11 years in that house. She would later try to describe that moment to Denise, and would fail every time to find words large enough for it. It was not simply that Eleanor was crying. Eleanor Marsh did not cry, not at her husband's funeral, not during the merger that nearly cost the family half its holdings, not during the years of silence with her son that everyone on staff quietly understood but never dared mention. What Angela saw in that room was something closer to a dam finally giving way after decades of careful maintenance, and she understood, without yet knowing any of the reasons why, that she was witnessing something no amount of money or composure had ever been able to hold back forever. Before we dive deeper, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you, and don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. To understand why that single afternoon would change the entire course of both their lives, you have to understand who these two women were before that door ever opened. Eleanor Marsh had not always been cold. She had built a real estate empire alongside her husband William, back when Atlanta was a different city and their name meant something closer to ambition than untouchable wealth. They had met young, before either of them had a dollar to their name, in a downtown diner where Eleanor waited tables and William swept floors for a small property management office 2 doors down. He used to tell people, in the early years of their marriage, that he fell in love with her before he ever learned her last name, because she argued with a customer over a bad tip with more fire than he had ever seen in anyone. The diner where they met sat on a corner that no longer exists in the Atlanta of today, torn down decades ago to make way for one of the very towers the Marsh name would eventually help build. In those early days, Eleanor worked double shifts to help her widowed mother keep the lights on in a small rented house on the edge of the city. And William, 3 years her senior, spent his afternoons sweeping the floors of an office he did not yet know would one day belong to him, in every way that mattered. He noticed her before she noticed him, The way she moved through a crowded room without ever once losing track of every order at every table. The way she stood up straighter than her tired shoulders wanted to whenever a customer tried to talk down to her. It took him 4 months to work up the nerve to ask for her number, and when he finally did, she told him she didn't have time for boys who couldn't hold down steady work. A comment that stung enough that he went out the very next week and talked his way into an entry-level position at the property office instead of just sweeping its floors. Together, they built something neither of their families believed they could. William had a talent for spotting undervalued buildings long before anyone else saw their potential, walking through half-abandoned blocks that other investors dismissed outright, and seeing, somehow, exactly what those same blocks would look like in 10 years once the city grew into them. Eleanor had a talent for negotiation that made grown businessmen twice her age reconsider offers they thought were final. Learned not from any business school, but from years of talking down difficult customers and stretching grocery money further than it had any right to stretch. Within a decade, they owned more property in Atlanta than either of them could have imagined as young people scraping together rent money, and the partnership between them, both in business and in marriage, became the kind of story other young couples in the city liked to hold up as proof that ambition and love did not have to compete against each other. They had one son together, Curtis, born in the early years of their success, delivered on a night William always swore he remembered more clearly than any business deal he ever closed. For a handful of years, the Marsh estate had been full of noise, full of laughter, full of the kind of life that money is supposed to buy, but rarely does. Neighbors who remembered those years still spoke of summer parties on the lawn, of William teaching a young Curtis to ride a bicycle down the long gravel driveway, while Eleanor called out encouragement from the porch, of Eleanor laughing loudly enough to be heard from the road, a sound so unlike the woman she would later become that longtime staff who heard the recordings from old home movies sometimes had to be told twice that it was really her. Curtis, in those years, remembered a mother who scooped him up without hesitation whenever he fell, who sat on the floor of his bedroom, reading the same 3 storybooks over and over, because he refused to fall asleep without hearing them in the exact same order every single night. He remembered a father who worked long hours but never missed a single one of his school plays, arriving still in his work clothes, smelling faintly of the construction sites he had spent the afternoon walking through with contractors. Those years, brief as they were in the larger span of the family's history, formed the foundation of every memory Curtis would spend the rest of his life measuring everything else against, a standard the family would never quite reach again after everything that followed. Then came a pregnancy, several years after Curtis was born, one Eleanor had not expected and had welcomed with a joy that surprised even her closest friends, who had always known her as a woman focused entirely on business. She spent months preparing a nursery at the end of the East Hall, choosing every detail herself, insisting on doing much of the decorating with her own hands rather than hiring someone else to do it for her. She painted the walls a soft yellow one weekend while William was traveling for work, refusing any help from staff, wanting the room to carry something of herself in every corner of it. She spent hours in second-hand shops looking for a rocking chair with the right kind of worn, comfortable armrests, rejecting a dozen brand-new options because none of them felt like the kind of chair a mother should hold her child in through long nights. William used to joke that she treated the nursery like her most important negotiation yet, refusing to compromise on a single detail, laughing about it with friends at dinner parties in the weeks leading up to the due date, unaware of how much that joke would come to hurt him later, once there was no longer any nursery to joke about at all. They had a name picked out long before the baby was due, a name Eleanor never spoke aloud to another living soul after everything that followed, because the daughter she carried for 9 months and loved before she ever drew a single breath did not survive her own birth. And something in Eleanor died quietly alongside her that same day. The details of that day, the ones staff would eventually piece together over years from fragments overheard here and there, were simple and devastating in the way tragedy so often is. There had been no warning signs during the pregnancy, no complications the doctors had flagged, nothing that gave William or Eleanor any reason to prepare for anything other than the ordinary joy they had spent months anticipating. The labor itself had gone on longer than expected, and somewhere in those final hours, something went wrong in a way the doctors were never fully able to explain to Eleanor's satisfaction. A failure of the body that no amount of preparation or money could have predicted or prevented. William remembered standing in a hospital hallway being told, in careful, practiced language, that his daughter had not survived, and remembered walking into the room afterward to find his wife holding a stillness in her arms that no words in his vocabulary were built to address. She did not speak about it afterward, not to William, not to the small number of friends who tried gently to reach her in the weeks that followed, not even to herself in any way she would later admit to. She closed the nursery door and asked that it never be opened again, that the furniture stay exactly where it was, that no one on staff ever mention it in her presence. The rocking chair she had spent weeks searching for sat exactly where she had placed it the day before the delivery, gathering dust behind a locked door. For years, no one on staff was permitted to count aloud. William, grieving in his own way and desperate to reach his wife through whatever distance had grown between them, tried for years to get her to talk about it, to grieve with him instead of alone, suggesting therapists, suggesting they try visiting the grave together on the anniversary each year, suggesting anything he could think of that might close even a small part of the distance that had opened between them. Eleanor had already decided, in the way she decided everything, that this was simply how it would be handled. She would carry it silently, and everyone around her would learn to work around the silence rather than through it. She returned to the business within weeks, threw herself into acquisitions and negotiations with an intensity that alarmed even William, who watched his wife transform grief into something that looked, from the outside, almost like ambition, though anyone who knew her closely enough understood it was something closer to a woman running as fast and as far from a feeling as her body would physically allow. The Marsh real estate holdings expanded significantly in the years following that loss, a fact the business press at the time attributed to Eleanor's sharpened focus, never once connecting it publicly to anything happening inside the walls of that quiet estate. Curtis was young when it happened, too young to fully understand what had changed in his household, but old enough to notice that his mother had become someone slightly different than the woman who used to laugh loudly enough to be heard from the road. He remembered, vaguely, being told he was going to have a baby sister, remembered the excitement of that news in the particular way small children absorb big events without fully grasping their weight, and remembered, just as vaguely, the sudden absence of any further conversation about it afterward, as though the entire subject had simply been erased from the household's vocabulary overnight. No one explained to him clearly what had happened. He learned, the way children in quiet houses often learn things, by paying close attention to what adults avoided saying rather than what they said. He grew up in a house that had gone quieter by degrees every year, watching his father try and fail repeatedly to reach a version of his mother that seemed to retreat further every time he got close. Family dinners, once loud with William's stories about difficult clients and Eleanor's sharp commentary on the day's negotiations, became quieter affairs, punctuated by long silences that Curtis learned early not to fill with questions. He noticed his mother stop mentioning the future in the casual way parents often do, stop talking about what Curtis might become, what the family might do next summer, as though some part of her had decided it was safer never to want anything too specifically ever again. By the time Curtis was a teenager, the estate that had once been full of noise had become the kind of house visitors described as beautiful but somehow cold, and Curtis, without ever fully articulating it even to himself, grew up believing that his mother's love had limits he could never quite locate, boundaries that existed somewhere just out of reach, no matter how hard he tried to close the distance. He excelled academically, partly out of genuine ability, and partly, he would later admit to almost no one, out of a hope that enough achievement might eventually earn him the kind of unguarded warmth he sometimes glimpsed in his mother during rare unguarded moments. Moments that always closed again before he could figure out how he had caused them in the first place. He left for college earlier than most of his peers, choosing a school across the country rather than the university many assumed he would attend closer to home, a choice his mother never openly objected to, but which Curtis always suspected disappointed her more than she ever said aloud. College gave him distance, and distance, he discovered, made the quiet of that house easier to bear from a comfortable remove. He built a life for himself that had little to do with real estate, studying international business instead, eventually taking a position overseas that kept him away from Atlanta for months and then years at a stretch, a pattern that suited both mother and son far better than either would have admitted if asked directly. William passed away 5 years before the afternoon Angela found Eleanor in that sitting room, his heart giving out suddenly during what should have been an ordinary morning, found by the estate's groundskeeper on the terrace, overlooking the garden he had spent decades tending to on weekends, as a way of unwinding from the pressures of the business. He and Eleanor had spent the last years of their marriage in a kind of quiet, practiced partnership, still loving in their own careful way, but never quite recovering the ease that had defined their early years together. They had built an entire life together out of the wreckage of a single terrible day, and in their own quiet way had made peace with a marriage that looked, from the outside, entirely successful, and felt, from the inside, like two people standing carefully on either side of a door neither of them ever opened again. At his funeral, Curtis, who had moved overseas years earlier partly to escape the particular quiet of that house, returned home and found himself standing beside a mother who did not cry, who accepted condolences with the same measured composure she brought to every business meeting, greeting old family friends and business associates with a steadiness that impressed everyone in attendance and disturbed her own son in ways he could not immediately name. He remembered standing at the graveside, watching her shake hands with people offering their sympathies, watching her thank them for coming in the exact same tone she might use to thank a contractor for finishing a project on schedule, and something in him broke in a way he had been holding together for years. The argument that followed, in the days after William's funeral, was not really about anything either of them could name clearly, not fully about the nursery neither of them ever discussed, not fully about the years of distance, but about all of it at once, poured out in words neither Curtis nor Eleanor ever fully took back. It began, as these things often do, over something small, a disagreement about how to handle a portion of the estate's paperwork in the days immediately following the funeral, and escalated within minutes into something far larger than either of them had intended. Curtis accused his mother of never once letting either of them, him or his father, close enough to actually help her carry whatever she was carrying, accused her of building an entire life around a grief she refused to acknowledge existed, of treating her own son like another asset to be managed, rather than a person she was supposed to love without conditions attached. Eleanor, cornered in a way she was not used to being cornered, retreated into the same composure that had protected her for decades, telling her son that grief was not something that needed an audience, that some things were simply hers to carry, and that she did not owe anyone, including him, an explanation for how she chose to survive it. She told him, in words she would later regret without ever finding the right moment to take them back, that he had no idea what real loss felt like, a comment that landed on Curtis with a weight far heavier than she likely intended, given how much of his own childhood had been shaped by loving a mother who felt permanently just out of reach. Curtis left for the airport 2 days later without saying goodbye properly, boarding a flight back overseas with a version of his mother's voice still echoing in his ears that he would spend years trying and failing to quiet. In the 5 years since, mother and son had spoken perhaps a handful of times, each conversation shorter and more careful than the last, birthday calls that lasted under 3 minutes, a single stiff phone call on the anniversary of William's death that neither of them mentioned again afterward, until eventually the calls stopped altogether, and the silence between them became simply the way things were. Eleanor never spoke of this to her staff, but everyone who worked in that house long enough eventually pieced together the outline of it, the way staff in every large household eventually learn the shapes of the grief they are paid to work quietly around without ever being permitted to ask about directly. Angela's life had taken a different shape entirely, built from necessity rather than ambition. She had come to work in that house as a young woman with a baby daughter of her own, grateful for steady wages and a roof that did not depend on a man staying faithful to keep it over her head. Angela's own husband had left before their daughter's first birthday, disappearing the way some men do when responsibility becomes heavier than they expected, taking with him whatever small savings the two of them had managed to put aside, and leaving Angela with a baby, a stack of unpaid bills, and a fierce, unspoken determination that she would never again build her sense of safety around a man's willingness to stay. She found the position at the Marsh estate through a cousin who had once worked in a similar household across town, and though the work was demanding and the hours long, Angela recognized immediately the value of steady wages, a private room for herself and her daughter, and the kind of stability that had been entirely absent from her life up to that point. She had built her entire adult life around the understanding that she alone was responsible for whoever depended on her, a lesson she absorbed so completely that she rarely allowed herself to imagine any other way of living, and she brought that same fierce responsibility into every single day of her employment at the estate, arriving early, staying late, and never once giving William or Eleanor Marsh any reason to question her reliability. She watched her daughter grow up half inside that estate, playing quietly in the gardens while Angela worked, learning early, and without complaint, that her mother's job came with rules the rest of the world did not have to follow, that certain rooms were off limits, that certain hours required silence, that the family they worked for was to be respected from a careful distance rather than approached with familiarity. Angela's daughter, whom she had named Naomi, grew up with a quiet, watchful intelligence that Angela recognized early and encouraged whenever she could, saving small amounts from her wages over the years, specifically so that Naomi would have options Angela herself had never had. Naomi eventually fell in love with a man who, much like Angela's own husband years earlier, proved unwilling to stay once real responsibility arrived in the form of a son. Angela's daughter named that son Tommy, raised him largely with Angela's help in those first years, and had every intention of building a stable, independent life for the two of them once she finished the nursing program she had enrolled in against considerable odds, working double shifts at a diner, not unlike the one where Eleanor herself had once worked decades earlier, studying late into the night after Tommy fell asleep, determined to give her son a future built on something more secure than the instability she herself had grown up navigating. An illness no one saw coming took her within 18 months of that diagnosis, moving through her body with a speed that left no time for the kind of preparation anyone imagines they would want when facing something like that. Angela remembered every detail of those 18 months with a clarity she wished she didn't have. The appointments, the treatments that seemed to work, and then didn't. The slow, unbearable process of watching her daughter's strength disappear by degrees, while Tommy, too young to understand what was happening, kept asking when his mother would feel well enough to play with him again the way she used to. Angela buried her only child at a small ceremony attended by a handful of people, took her grandson home the very next week, and did what she had always done in the face of loss. She kept working. She kept her grandson close. She told herself that grief was something you carried privately, folded it into the same quiet discipline that had carried her through every other hardship in her life, and never once considered asking Eleanor Marsh, the woman who employed her, for any accommodation beyond what the job already required. She simply adjusted her schedule where she could, leaned on Denise for help where she needed it, and continued forward the same way she always had, one obligation at a time, one day at a time, refusing to let herself imagine any version of the future that did not include her showing up for Tommy exactly the way she had always shown up for everyone who depended on her. What neither woman understood yet, standing on opposite sides of that same locked door, was that the house itself had been holding its breath for years, waiting for something to finally break the silence both of them had built their lives around. Down the same hallway, where Eleanor now sat with Tommy asleep against her chest, there was a second door that had not been opened in 5 years, a nursery no one on staff was permitted to mention, filled with furniture no one was allowed to move, holding inside it the one piece of grief Eleanor Marsh had never let herself say out loud to a single living person, not her husband before he died, not her estranged son living an ocean away, and certainly not the staff paid to keep her secrets without ever asking what those secrets cost her. Staff who had worked at the estate long enough had their own theories about that hallway, passed quietly between new hires and veterans over the years, the way certain stories survive inside a household without ever being confirmed. Some believed the room held nothing more than old furniture Eleanor simply hadn't gotten around to clearing out. Others, closer to the truth without ever fully knowing it, suspected something far more personal, something tied to the years before Curtis stopped visiting, something none of them felt entitled to ask about directly. Denise, who had worked in that house nearly as long as Angela, once told her over coffee in the early years of her employment that some houses hold grief the way old buildings hold water damage, quietly, in places you can't see, until one day something gives way without warning. There had been, over the years, a handful of near misses, moments when the careful silence of that house came close to cracking, without anyone quite realizing how close it had come. A contractor once asked casually about renovating the East Wing, and was informed, in a tone that ended the conversation immediately, that no renovations would be taking place there under any circumstances. A young housekeeper, new to the estate and unaware of the unspoken rules, once asked directly why the door at the end of the hallway was always locked, and was let go from her position within the week. An outcome so swift and so unexplained that every staff member who witnessed it understood immediately, without needing to be told twice, exactly which subjects were never to be raised again in Eleanor Marsh's presence. Angela had absorbed this lesson early in her own employment, long before Naomi grew old enough to wander the halls herself, long before Tommy was ever born. She had learned, the way all long-serving staff eventually learn, exactly which doors not to open, exactly which silences not to fill, and she had built an entire career around the discipline of not asking questions that were not hers to ask. It was precisely this discipline that made the sight of Eleanor holding Tommy so disorienting, because it represented, without Angela yet fully understanding why, the first crack she had ever personally witnessed in a wall she had spent 11 years believing was permanent. Angela did not know any of this history in detail yet, standing frozen with a tea tray in her trembling hands outside that sitting room. All she knew was that the woman in front of her had just been caught in a moment she was never supposed to witness, and that whatever came next was going to change something in that house that had stayed exactly the same for far too long. She stepped back slowly, pulled the door closed without a sound, and walked away with her heart pounding, telling herself she had imagined the whole thing, that tomorrow, everything would return to the way it had always been between them, employer and employee, invisible and untouchable. She carried that image with her through the rest of her shift that day, through dinner preparations and Tommy's bath time and the quiet hour after he fell asleep when she normally allowed herself to simply sit and rest. She found herself replaying the sight of Eleanor's face over and over, the wetness in her eyes, the stillness in her posture, the way her hand had rested on Tommy's back, as though she was afraid that letting go, even slightly, might cause something irreplaceable to slip away. Angela had spent 11 years believing she understood the boundaries of that house completely, believing that Eleanor Marsh was exactly the woman the newspapers described, guarded and untouchable, and entirely closed off from anything resembling ordinary human need. What she had seen that afternoon did not fit inside any of the boundaries she thought she understood, and she went to bed that night with a quiet, unsettled feeling she could not name, the same feeling that comes just before something long buried finally begins working its way back up to the surface. She lay awake longer than usual that night, listening to Tommy's steady breathing in the small bed beside hers, turning the day's events over slowly in her mind, the way she turned over every difficult problem in her life, methodically, without drama, searching for some practical way to understand what she had witnessed. She considered, briefly, whether she ought to say something to Eleanor directly, some small acknowledgement that would let her employer know Angela understood the moment required discretion, but she dismissed the idea almost as quickly as it arrived. 11 years of careful invisibility had taught her that the safest response to witnessing something private was to behave, in every visible way, as though she had witnessed nothing at all, and she resolved to carry that same discipline into the following morning, no matter what expression she found on Eleanor's face when their paths inevitably crossed again. Morning came, as mornings always do, indifferent to the weight of what had happened the day before. Angela rose early, prepared Tommy's breakfast, walked him to the end of the driveway where the school bus collected him each day, and returned to the main house to begin her usual rounds, bracing herself the entire time for some acknowledgement, some shift in Eleanor's demeanor, some sign that the previous afternoon had changed anything at all between them. What she found instead was Eleanor exactly as she had always been, composed, distant, entirely unremarkable in her interactions with staff, issuing the same brief instructions in the same measured tone she always used, offering no indication whatsoever that anything unusual had occurred in that sitting room only a day earlier. For nearly 2 weeks, this pattern held steady, and Angela began to allow herself to believe that perhaps the moment truly had been an isolated incident, some private unraveling, that Eleanor had already folded back into the same careful composure she used to manage every other difficult feeling in her life. Angela busied herself with the ordinary rhythms of her days, grateful, in a quiet way, that whatever she had witnessed seemed unlikely to disrupt the stability she had worked so hard to build for herself and Tommy inside that house. She told herself she had been foolish to lie awake worrying about it, that some things were simply not hers to understand, and that the safest course of action, as always, was to keep her head down and continue doing her work exactly as she always had. But small things began accumulating in ways Angela could not entirely dismiss, no matter how determined she was to see nothing unusual in them. Denise mentioned, almost in passing one evening, while the two of them folded linens together in the laundry room, that Eleanor had asked, out of nowhere, which room the boy slept in, a question she had never once asked in 3 years of Tommy living on the estate grounds. Angela laughed it off at the time, suggesting Eleanor was simply curious in a passing way, the kind of idle question any employer might ask about a staff member's family, without any deeper meaning behind it. Denise, who had worked in that house long enough to recognize when something was shifting beneath the surface, did not seem entirely convinced, though she said nothing further on the subject that evening. A few days later, the head groundskeeper mentioned to Angela, with a puzzled expression that suggested he found the request just as strange as she did, that Eleanor had instructed him to repair a section of fencing near the smaller garden closest to the staff quarters, a section that had been broken for years without anyone bothering to fix it, explaining only that she wanted the area safe in case anyone needed to use it. Angela did not immediately connect this instruction to Tommy, who had been warned repeatedly to stay away from that particular section of the garden precisely because of the broken fence, but the timing struck her as an odd coincidence she found herself unable to fully set aside. Then came the morning Angela found a small stack of children's books on the side table in the main hallway. Books she did not recognize from anywhere in the house, clearly new, clearly purchased specifically and recently, sitting exactly where anyone walking past would notice them, but positioned in such a way that suggested deliberate placement rather than careless forgetfulness. Angela stood looking at them for a long moment before continuing on with her morning duties, unable to shake the growing sense that something in the quiet architecture of that house was beginning, slowly and carefully, to shift. If you're already invested in Angela and Eleanor's story, don't scroll away just yet. Like this video. Share it with someone who would love a story like this one. Tell us in the comments what you think Eleanor is hiding behind that locked door. And subscribe to the channel so you're notified the moment the next part of this story goes live.